Hi, this is Syd Jones. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Atocha main pile, since it's such a focal point when discussing anything to do with the Atocha. So let's take a look at the chart that I have here. This is right out of my book, Atocha Treasure Adventures, Sweat of the Sun, Tears of the Moon. We'll talk a little bit about how the Margarita and the Atocha sites relate to each other. If you've read my book, you understand that the Margarita was being driven to the north during the storm that sank her. And they did see the waves breaking along the reef and attempted to stop the progression of the Margarita into the reef area. They did drop an anchor here that only stabilized the ship momentarily until the anchor line snapped. Luckily for them, the Margarita was carried over the top of the reef, past the reef feature, and then continued on up towards what we now call the quicksands area, another shallow area. They did try to drop several other anchors during this interim period between the original anchor and the later grounding up in the quicksands. None of those anchor lines were able to maintain the ship in that position. They all snapped. So the Margarita continued on and then grounded up here. Later that morning, the Margarita assembled crew and passengers on the decks looked out, and about 7 o'clock in the morning, they saw the Atocha come, also apparently coming over the outer reef area. Unlike the Margarita, the Atocha, instead of being carried over the outer reef by the hurricane waves, was actually dropped onto the reef. Its mainmast went over the side, and then they said it sank shortly afterwards. Well, we don't know what shortly there afterwards really means. But our evidence leads us to this trail right here, this short trail called the 165 degree line. Now don't be confused by that degree. That is a degree heading that was set up when we first found the Atocha main pile. We later found this trail that descended southerly, actually to the southeast, towards the outer reef on about 165 degree heading. So that's why it was called a 165 degree line. However, the original progression of the ship was certainly from the outer reef up in the direction of where the Atocha main pile would be, right there. And so the 165 degree line, the artifacts scattered along this portion of the trail, reflect items that the ship was shedding as it was in a sinking, semi-sinking condition up until the point where it actually made contact with the bottom and stayed, at least till the end of the first storm. That's where the Atocha main pile would be. Now note that there's a tremendous amount of distance that is covered going from the Atocha main pile to the Memorial Day, to the 9 bronze cannons, the Bank of Spain, Galleon Anchor, Emerald Cross, phase cannons, all the way up here to the North Galleon Anchors. This is all material from the second storm. There was a second storm that occurred in the area, much more powerful than the first, that sank the Atocha and the Margarita. And this storm was probably like a category 5 or so. That second storm was able to dislodge a large portion of the Atocha wreckage and carry it pretty much intact through this mud area as a semi-sunk, almost like a raft, I guess you could imagine it. And it did start to drop material along the way. When the bottom configuration changed and the bottom came up, it paused here for a little while after dropping 9 cannons. It then came up into another shallower area and dropped more coins and other artifacts. Eventually it dropped the Galleon Anchor. The Emerald Cross was found up in here, as well as a lot of gold bars and other church material. Later on, phase cannon was dropped. That's a 4,600 pound bronze cannon. And then there's 2 giant Galleon Anchors ended up all the way up here. So that is pretty much the known trail. There's been other exploration, and other items have been found even beyond where the North Galleon Anchors are and more to the northwest. But that is essentially the track of the Atocha. It's over 12 nautical miles long, pretty impressive. The Margarita track is much shorter. Where the Margarita grounded, that's where its so-called main pile was. And then later in the morning of the initial storm, the Margarita did break up about 10 o'clock in the morning, and it deposited what we called the cannon and cannonball clump features. There was a north cannon and anchor feature up to the north. Those features continued on up to the north, all part of the first storm. The second storm that moved so much from the Atocha main pile off to the northwest also did affect the Margarita as well. So there's kind of a secondary scatter ghosting of artifacts from all these main features on the Margarita site as well. So that was a very powerful storm. Okay, so what we're going to focus on is the Atocha main pile area and what's there. And we'll talk a little bit about this 165-degree line because not much has been mentioned that in the public, and it's kind of an interesting feature. So first off, what was at the actual Atocha main pile? Well, we have here some charts that were generated at the time. Since I'm all doing this by hand, they'll see me move pieces of paper away. Right here, you can see a cross-section of the ballast pile of the Atocha feature. And what you're looking at here, this dark line here represents the bottom topography of the actual limestone cap rock underneath. And as you can see, the ballast and the other artifacts that are associated all through here are suspended off of that actual hard pan feature. They're suspended in this dense oolitic mud that the Atocha settled into. And this mud was great stuff because it preserved a lot of the organic material on the actual Atocha main pile feature. So you can see some parts of the hard pan were not mapped in. That's simply because there were planks, which you can see kind of a cross section here, that protruded outward when we did this section of the Atocha main pile when we were mapping it, and we didn't have the data to be able to mark in exactly where the hard pan configuration was. So what this represents, it's a little bit like cutting a cake. When you slice a cake vertically, you get a stratigraphic view of the inside of the cake, and that's what this is. And we did sections like this all along the main pile feature, but we didn't do it over the entire feature because there was just way too much material to do this every 6 inches or every foot. We chose a different method to map in the artifacts. So we were relying on these vertical cut representations to show what the ballast and artifact strata actually look like, as if it was cut like a cake. And then we also used another method. I'll move this away. And underneath, you'll be able to see kind of a layered effect of the Atocha main pile generated on a map. Now this shows absolutely no ballast. This is just artifacts. And it is also done in a stratigraphic way. So we can identify which layers of artifacts belong where relative to each other. So on the very upper layer, even though there's no ballast material here, in this layer you can see some silver bars exposed. Over here, there's coin chests exposed. A lot of these green objects here are copper ingots. There was about 20 tons of copper ingots on the Atocha, and a lot of those were in the upper portion of the ballast pile. So if we peel off this layer right here, we get down to the next layer of material. And again, you can see a very large group of silver bars. There's intact coin chests in this area. There's more wood, more coin chests. There's dunnage in here, and you start to see a lot more of that. There's actually spare cannon carriage parts, more copper ingots, broken pottery and ceramics, and moving up in this area, some silver items. You can see underneath, in the next layer down, you can start to see broken barrels and barrel hoops. So if we peel this next layer off, this next stratigraphic layer off, we get down to yet another layer of artifacts. Here you see more scattered silver bars. There's actually a piece of rope that survived here that we found. Broken coin chests and intact coin chests. There were 18 intact coin chests found on the Atocha. And we're almost all the way down through the mud column, and you can start to see some of the lower hull features on the Atocha right there. So I'm going to remove this layer. And now you can start to see some of the wood that survived. Now, finding wood like this was an exceptional discovery. We certainly didn't expect to find this much or in the condition that it was. And what we're looking at here, these timbers right here are called floor timbers. There's another one here, there's another one up here. Floor timbers are actually the bottom part of ribs. And of course, ribs are kind of U-shaped features. I got this great drawing from the internet, from Wooden Boat magazine. And here you can see half of a wood ship's rib section. In other words, the other half of the rib would normally be over in this area. They're just showing you from the keel up one side. So down here, right in the very center, obviously where the keel is, and these lower portions of the ribs, and you can see how close together they are, these are called floor timbers. Attached to the floor timbers are the next section of wood that create the shape of the rib, and those are called futtocks. And they start off with the first futtocks, second futtocks, third futtocks, as they go up the sides of the ship. And what we have here, in going back to our original Atocha design, or Atocha recoveries, is we've got the floor timbers. These are the lowest portion of the ship's hull, right there. And in association, we do have some other portions that are part of that first, and maybe even some of the second futtock structural elements that are there. These pieces right in here are actually outer hull timbers. Very, very thick, very, very long. These are part of the outer hull. But notice what's missing. Here's the very bottom of the ribs in this section of the ship. And there is absolutely no keel right here. As a matter of fact, the outer hull timbers are missing right here. Now, when we go further down the trail in the direction that the Atocha came from, we do find a number of other outer hull planking elements that are down there, but we don't find any part of the keel. So what you're seeing here, this isn't the entire bottom of the Atocha. This is actually a small portion of it. And if you imagine a little bit like a hard-boiled egg, when the Atocha was carried over the reef and then dropped onto it, it may have flexed and damaged a section of the ship's bottom, but not the entire thing. In other words, there were cracks that ran up. The material that the hull was made out of was certainly broken and fractured, but it didn't completely fall apart. There were over 200 tons of ballast stone that was inside the ship. And yet, on the artifact trail that leads up to the Atocha main pile, the first ballast stone that we find was actually about 400 feet prior to the ship grounding here on the bottom at the main pile. So at the main pile area, there was a tremendous amount of ballast stone that was all in this area, but it wasn't the entire ship's allotment of ballast stone, nor was all the silver and the coin chests and all the other heavy items. All of that was certainly here and present in the main pile area, but it was also present 5 to 7 miles away in that secondary scatter as well. So certainly the bottom of the ship was flexed and broken, and maybe a portion of the keel was ripped off. The keel would normally be in this area. And as the ship came up here, it certainly had inertia behind it. The hurricane waves and winds were driving it along in a progressively more sinking condition until it finally hit in this area on the bottom with such force that it rolled the ribs over. So these lower portions of the ribs are all rolled in one direction, and it looks from the artifacts that we found that the ship actually skidded forward after breaking away this part of the bottom, and a lot of ballast was dumped out here, a lot of the other heavy items, but not all of them. And so what that gives us a clue about is how the rest of the ship was able to take off during the second storm 1 month later and go off in a completely different direction. It seems that the ballast and the silver bars and the coin chests that were all dropped in this area were lightened up the remaining portions of the Atocha enough that it left the damaged area and that heavy weighted material in this area that still had enough integrity left to the hull that that hull structure was able to start moving away from this area, leaving the damaged area behind and continuing on up to the west-northwest in the second storm. And that's what led to that large, long trail of secondary scatter. So another feature I'd like to show you, we're going to go over here to another portion of the chart, kind of an interesting feature. This is part of the chart that shows artifacts that were deposited as the ship was going into that sinking condition. It was a semi-sunk at this point, and it was bobbing up and down, semi-sunk in the ocean, being carried along by these hurricane waves up to the point where the main pile was. Now, you'll see a line over here. This line is that 165-degree line projected to the southwest from the Atocha main pile, and there are distance marks on here. And the thing that I want to show you on this particular chart, right over here near the dividers, is that on the very bottom, remember this is hard mud that is the primary feature, and the mud is anywhere from 3 to 5 feet thick. The top 6 inches or so is very soft, the next couple of inches a little harder, and then below that it's very, very dense. It's been there for a long time. The Atocha, in its semi-sinking condition, was being carried along by the hurricane waves and being picked up and then slammed down into the sea floor. Now, the depth here is about 60 feet. So obviously most of the Atocha wasn't out of the water anymore. As it was hitting the bottom, it was shaking off artifacts, components from the ship, and you can see that kind of scattered around. But the thing I'm pointing out to you here, these are actual scratch marks in the seafloor, in the hard pan, that Capt rock in the bottom that we mapped in. There's nails, there's scratch marks, and those were left when the Atocha was slammed down through the mud and pushed all the way into the hard pan. And as we advance more towards the north, or rather I guess it would be the northwest, right? Because this is the reciprocal of the 165-degree line. You can see another feature right here where, again, there are scratch marks in the bottom along with spikes, fragments of wood embedded in the hard pan, that hard Capt rock right there. And then moving north again, some other artifacts. You know, there's a sword, there's silver plates, there's other material here as well, mortar and pestle, and here yet another big impact on the bottom, not going in that 165 degree along that axis, but actually pointing more to the north. So even though the artifact trail pretty much follows that reciprocal 165 degrees, the skid marks, or the impact marks on the bottom, scratch marks, actually run about due north. And then as we advance further yet to the north, we find yet more scratch marks right up here amongst the artifacts. So, and how far are these? Well, actually they're pretty close to about the same distance away from each other. If I back the camera off here, you can see I've got the divider set up. Here's one set of scratch marks on the bottom. Here's the other set. And then we go to the next group, come down here, and look at that. It lines up. And then we go down back to the original ones, and there they are right there. So about 30-foot difference between these impact points. So that must have been the frequency of the waves that was actually picking up the Atocha, lifting it up, elevating it from the bottom, and then slamming it down in as it was progressively filling up more and more with water. Now, we did not find any stern castle material in this area. If the ship was coming down bow first, obviously it could be, these scratch marks could be part of the forward keel that were being driven into the ocean floor. Or if it was the stern of the ship coming down first, certainly we would expect to find pieces of the rudder, which would be very vulnerable and would be likely torn off very early if it was making contact with the sea floor. Ironically, the pintles and gudgeons that held the rudder in place were actually found 7 miles away up in the quicksands back in the 1970s. So that implies that the stern of the ship was pretty much intact and went up in that direction along with the majority of the Atocha structure after it broke away from the main pile area. So there are some interesting things to consider about the Atocha wreck site. And we'll talk more about the Atocha, of course, in later videos. Thanks for watching.